Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to see how the education process is going on at your university, and even, be a committee member for one of your, thesis, dissertation defenses. So I am very, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm very glad. So I would like to present one stream of my studies, just like selected studies where we worked with user-generated content. So I won't go into very much detail about each particular study. I'm going to give you kind of like a broad stroke overview of what can be done with user-generated content, and what issues are still there and waiting for researchers to be addressed, okay? So if you think that I talk too quickly or you don't understand, just let me know, okay? Maybe I need to rephrase something, so feel free to let me know, okay? No, excuse me. It worked. I don't know. Oh, it was working before. Mm-hmm. It was working before. It's stuck somehow. There. Now it does work, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. There. Okay. Looks like, all right. Now it's where we can go. All right. So my interest in user-generated content started from the interest in quantifying qualitative data. So when I was a PhD researcher, I worked with qualitative answers, like free-flow answers in consumer surveys. And I got interested in, getting quantitative sense of qualitative data. And you know that, recently, user-generated content has just expanded, right? And researchers are using more and more this, user-generated content as an alternative research mode to surveying individuals. And when we, with my graduate student, did a systematic review of studies that used user-generated content as a research mode, we found that there were 5 main topics deal with issues in tourism and hospitality applications. So one topic, by far the largest, was service quality. The next one, destination image and reputation. The third, user-generated content as electronic word of mouth. Travel experiences and behavior in blogs. And lastly, there was just few studies, and it was in 2013, that added the spatial dimension to user-generated content and dealt with mobility patterns of tourists. So the majority of the studies in these 4 streams used content analysis as a method to quantify the content. And sometimes when you add the quantitative rating, satisfaction rating, you can do really kind of like creative things just using user-generated content and answer questions of real destinations and real hospitality establishments. However, we know that content analysis is a long-standing research methodology, and the issues of sampling, population, generalization has been solved for this methodology in traditional, when it is applied to traditional media. For example, when you do the content analysis of newspaper materials, you know your sampling frame, right? You know all the titles, all the newspapers, how many times per week they, issued. You know the geographical distribution. You know the circulation. So you really, by stratification and clustering, like applying these techniques, sampling techniques, you can get a representative sample. You quantify the content, and you can generalize your results to the whole population of all materials, right? So this has been solved. However, with user-generated content, you can see when it is kind of dispersed in the internet, no sampling frames, things are not that clear. Therefore, we as researchers always need to define, what is our population, right? What is our sample? How generalizable our results are? And we have to be very careful with that. So again, based on the review of all user-generated content studies by 2013, we decided to expand into the visual, user-generated content, because there were just not that many, all right, studies that dealt with visuals, and methodologically we thought they were the most problematic, so to speak, okay? So the question was, can we, by applying, using user-generated content and applying content analysis methodologies, differentiate between the image, particularly Peru image, which is projected by DMOs, and which is reflected through postings of tourists in, this media sharing websites, okay? So with the DMO, it was very easy, because we just took all images that were on their official website, right? So in this sense, we got a census, all right? With Flickr, it wasn't that easy, because for the year preceding the research, there was 23,000 plus images, right? So we need to apply some sort of randomization to randomly sample, so then again we can generalize, all right? At all postings on Flickr, okay? And by arguing that Flickr is one of the biggest sharing media website, that it is generalizable for the population of English-speaking, tourists, because again, we did our search in English, okay? So we took, again, randomly the photos, and we had these two respective samples, okay, for the images. The next step is to do the system of categories. And again, there can be different approaches. For example, we looked, at the pictures, trying to make sense of them, and we found that the most conducive to coding, there was the approach of when you describe your image in just 4 categories, okay? So 1 or 2 main categories and 1 or 2 residual, so to speak, categories, right? For example, this image can be characterized as wildlife, right? This one is nature and landscape. And for this image, we had 2 categories, nature and landscape and archaeological site, okay? So this is the system of categories. So we have 20 categories. This is the most frequent ones. This is the pulled, from Flickr and DMO. So you can see that nature and landscape is, the main, category. However, once you have your categories, you can do the counting, and as soon as you get your numbers, you can do comparisons, right? So if we look at DMOs and Flickr now, we can see that some categories are, differ, right? Differ. Since it was, user-generated content, images, not unstructured data, so we didn't apply any corrections here, but we just looked at the real, chi-square values and p-values. And we can see, for example, that for way of life, Flickr users were much more interested in how people live their lives. And there were much less images in the DMO's sample on that, right? So you can do comparisons. The next, you observe that some images have, can be described by, let's say, 3 categories, right? And these images are quite often, they're popping out quite often. For example, people, traditional clothing, festival and rituals. There are many images that could be described just in these 3 categories. Therefore, the question is to calculate co-occurrences and somehow, aggregate the whole pool of images into sort of maps, right? So by applying some kind of like simple statistics, you can differentiate whether the co-occurrence of images is kind of like by chance, under the assumption that they're independent, these 2 categories, or there is a statistical association, okay? So by doing that, you can derive, 2 maps, and again see kind of like visually, like what's the difference between DMO and Flickr. In this case, DMO is kind of like more thought out, complex image. Flickr is kind of like simpler. However, there are certain, co-occurrences which dominate, like people, traditional clothing, way of life, for example, right? So you can do this as well, like quantify user-generated content. So if you add this spatial dimension, right, you can see how it, like the photographs, like look in space, right? So you can see that the DMO market each 24 of 24 its regions more or less evenly, right? Putting probably more, emphasis on Cusco and Machu Picchu, right? However, if you look at Flickr, which reflects the pattern of travelers, Western travelers, English-speaking people, you can see kind of like the route when they travel, right? It is Lima, Ica, Arequipa, Cusco, Lake Titicaca, a little bit of jungles, okay? So again, you can see what is like the interest of the tourists, okay? So there are some methodology implications, marketing implications, but we will not dwell on that, okay? So the next study was to see whether with the system of categories with like user-generated content, we can detect the cultural differences in image producers, okay? So the question was whether image which is transparent from the pictures of tourists to Russia, American tourists, and South Korean tourists different, okay? So this was the main kind of like question, okay? And again, you have to look at the criteria by which you collect your images, right? So we have a set of like 6 criteria, which proved to be quite restrictive. And it led us to, come up with 2 different, methodology for data collection, right? So American we took from Flickr, and in this time we took geotagged images. Only 2% of images are geotagged, and we took them. It was 4,000 photos, and again now you can randomize, aiming at the maximum number of images, the targeted number of images, but also you need to randomize with respect to different users. So it is not like if I post 100 or 200 images, that's my image, right? Not image kind of like of different people, right? So you need to randomize with the number of users. Korean sample we took from Korean network neighbor, because much less Flickr just couldn't produce as many. So this is probably a limitation. However, the goal is to have a representative sample for these tourists and for these tourists. And maybe this is kind of like okay, though we of course would have preferred the universal procedure. You can see that there are less unique users, and again, this is a reason for concern. However, if you look at the statistics for Russian tourism, you see that much less Korean tourists than American tourists to Russia. So probably it reflects, you know, the situation, the real, how things stand, okay? So again, we had two pools of images, and again, without certain quantification, without certain category system, you cannot, you know, say whether they're different or not, right? You need categories, and you need the formal approach to, you know, dealing with user-generated content. In this case, since the images were much more dispersed, and they had, you know, they were sort of richer than the Peruvian images, we had more categories, okay? So, and we did a different, like, used a different approach. So we constructed the two-tier category system. So the first tier was people, nature landscape, place, urban area or rural area, space, transport and infrastructure, activities, season, architecture, heritage, and state power. When you put Russian flags, people in military uniforms, some, you know, iconic like military marks of Russia, okay? So this is the first tier category. And each has certain, you know, subgroups, right? For example, for nature landscape, it's just two, yes and no, right? But this is for people, single, group, few random people, crowd, and again, no, okay? Doesn't apply, okay? So we looked and we did decoding, and this is the Cooccurrence. We used Cooccurrence, which accounted for agreement simply by chance as a more, you know, conservative and strict measure of reliability of coding. The coding approach was different. So we had one image, right? And you go through like 1, 2, 3 category, like people. Okay, how many, like few random people or crowds, for example, right? Land, nature or landscape, yes or no, place. So you can go by a you know, prescribed procedure, not rather a holistic, you know, evaluation, okay? So again, once you quantified your data set, right, you can make comparisons, okay? And by like looking at this, you can see, for example, that way of life, how Russian people live their lives, Americans are much more interested, right, than Korean tourists, okay? And if you, for example, look at here, right, tourist spaces, tourism places, you can see that the Koreans are more interested, have more, like statistically more photographs in these categories. Again, you can make comparisons, okay? We did the co-occurrence analysis using the same approach. It's just that instead of maps, we put it in a table because maps are awkward. And you can see that the table is symmetrical, right? So it is symmetrical, but the links between, you know, two categories for Russian and for American subsets, they are different. For example, tourism spaces, right? Tourism spaces and people, right? For Americans and Korean, you can see the level of significance is C here. So it's a higher significance at 0.001 than for American, which is 0.05, for example, okay? So there is a symmetry, co-occurrence there, but definitely Korean people pay more attention to some, you know, features of the image, while Americans pay, you know, to other, okay? So for example, this is food and things and food. Americans tend to photograph in the normal setting, Russian live their lives. And for example, food in Korean is a standalone category. See, nothing, no co-occurrences, just like the products in a store, okay? Again, if you add the geospatial dimension to this data, you can see how the patterns of these tourists differ in space. And you can see that, for example, for Korean sample, they are, you know, clustered around the, this big trains, Trans-Siberian train, around cruises to the Russian Far East, capitals of Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. So that's again the main artery, you know, the trail roads, okay? For Americans, while these arteries, train roads also visible, the you know, photos is much more dispersed, okay? Photos much more dispersed. So how to go back from this data to make the conclusion or to make interpretation in terms of the original research question, how it is reflected the culture of tourists. We managed that to interpret, but this is not my kind of like point. It's kind of long discussion, so I will move. Okay. So now, the good. Sorry. Yeah.
So, who assigned the pictures to the characteristics, or the way around? I mean,
the coders. There was a main coder, and we did reliability study, took part of the sample and like almost 300 and do reliability. So we said that reliability is good, so, but one coder did all.
One coder is one expert, not the tourist, right? It's not the tourist.
Categories, no, that's us. That's us who classified. Yes, researchers classify. Yes, but now that's a little bit different, okay? So now the issue is, that's a good question, because what so far we have been dealing with is manifest content, okay? So the approach to classification is that if you look at the image and classify it into the number of categories, you claim that everyone who sees this image and has this number of categories can classify it the same way, okay? So manifest content can be classified more or less reliably, right? Either by me as a researcher or by you or by tourists, okay? However, what about latent content? Sometimes you can see the picture 1 and 2 and it looks like the same thing, right? But one picture projects very pleasing and attractive feeling, you agree, right? And another picture something gloomy, dreary, right? So in this case, we're dealing with the latent content, right? And by, you know, when we deal with latent content, we cannot claim that if I classify, that everyone will classify the same, right? Because this is a matter of perception, right? Okay? The matter of perception, and for that, we need, you know, people to classify and to arrive to some kind of like distribution, right? To the mean, so to speak, right? So what is this picture on, say, clean, dirty? What impression does it project, right? One person is not enough for that, right? Okay. So we came up after several pilot tests with a system of dimensions, right? Which are conducive, so to speak, of classification, okay? So we took Eckner and Ricci as, you know, main like data source, but we tested, and we came with kind of like cognitive, you know, latent attributes like overcrowded or sparse, clean or dirty, developed, underdeveloped, safe, unsafe, and so forth, right? And with 4 affective dimensions, again, classical, which everyone knows, right? Pleasant, unpleasant, relaxing, distressing, arousing, sleepy, exciting, gloomy, sort of kind of like convention, right? Okay. And now we asked M-Turks, do you know this service on Amazon? When people, you know, for little money can do, you know, intelligence tasks, okay? So we took our original Korean and American photographs, okay? Randomly sampled, okay? Checked that the samples are representative of the main, you know, pool, all right? And did 10 surveys, like 10 pictures in each survey, so 10 surveys, and gave it to Turks to evaluate each survey, okay, on all these dimensions: cognitive, affective, whether impression is positive or negative, and whether looking at this photograph, they want to visit the destination, okay? So whether it gives them something to go. And each survey, each bundle, okay, was evaluated by 53 participants, okay, to make sure that we can, average, all right? And can kind of like exclude offenders who just, clicked for money but didn't really put effort into that, okay? So by doing this, we found that if you compare American and Korean samples on how they perceive the destination Russia in terms of these dimensions, you can see that there is no difference, okay? So this one is marginally significant, but still, the only one is this, all right? But again, if you correct for, like apply Bonferroni correction for similar tests, it also won't be significant, meaning that the latent content is something which just destination just has, right? And it doesn't matter whether, the American people do pictures or Korean, it's something which is there, right? You can, control for manifest content, and I can do, the beautiful building, right? And some maybe nature, but if you do the urban areas and like things like that, all this is something, which is reflected similarly. Therefore, we took these two pools together, okay? Now you can see which, features make, the most positive impression. So that's the series of regressions, right? And you can see that the positive impression is made by when you have groups of people in a tourism setting, right? And in a tourism space. Right, a lot of like minuses is because of the coding, the scale, like positive, negative. But if we go like accurately, it will work. Just kind of like trying to do it quicker. Now, in terms of whether people want to visit, like how cognitive attributes affect this. We found that only 3 cognitive, latent attributes: clean, dirty, friendly, unfriendly, and uniquely Russian, okay? They positively, influence the desire to visit, okay? And very similar, the positive impression, very similar. So then we tested for affective attributes as a mediator. And when these affective attributes were in the model, then here, the last one. Only one cognitive dimension was significant. It is uniquely Russian, okay? So if you have unpleasant and pleasant and arousing sleepy, clean, dirty doesn't matter anymore, all right? So it's already kind of like the variance goes in pleasant, unpleasant. And only uniquely Russian stands for, what the destination actually should care about, okay? How are we doing on time? We're doing okay? Probably 10 more minutes, okay? 15 minutes? Okay. Okay. So this was kind of like the images, and obviously the next kind of like step would be to try, and we did some preliminaries with my colleague. It's very good to have colleagues who are technically savvy, So we tried several automatic image recognition softwares, trying to figure out whether they can detect, images reliably. But this work is still in progress. But I believe that this is probably the next step. Okay. So in my last question,
Do you think it's possible? It's like a Likert scale, right?
This is Likert scale. Yeah.
So is it possible that different cultures use the scale differently, or?
That's excellent question, and probably in M-Turks we tested them for cultures. So the bulk of M-Turks were Americans. Okay, we had just 15%, I would say, who was not Americans. We didn't find differences, okay? But this is the good question. You mean how Turks, raters, whether their testing depends on their culture?
Yeah, like a 7 for you would be a 3 for me, right? So if
yes, that's right. Yeah, that's what I'm kind of saying, that we had the majority who were Americans and only just small number of Turks who were not, okay? So it's better to test for that when you have more or less comparable sizes, okay? But in our case, we didn't find, like we did some tests, okay? But we mentioned this as a future research in the paper, so yeah, we were honest here. All right, so now I would like to give you some overview of just very recent study and very recent research, which is not a completed paper. We haven't published this. We just submitted it for a conference. But I would say that it illustrates the issue which is getting more and more attention in tourism literature and hospitality literature. This is how to recognize sentiments in consumer reviews, okay? So this originated from that area, but the art of this has not yet established. And if you're kind of like interested in this topic, I mean, there is plenty of room to kind of like to contribute, right, to the science, okay? So sentiment analysis is how you can detect favorable, unfavorable, and neutral attitudes in, you know, consumer reviews, in writings, in whatever, right? So again, this is a long-standing issue in content analysis, right? However, now the question is how to do it automatically, right? You can do favorable, unfavorable, neutral with people, right? But again, when we do user-generated content, and especially big data consumer reviews, you need something more, you know, speedy, right? So we wanted to kind of like approach this, and this is what we have, and please feel free to give kind of like feedback. So the data set was the survey. It was the survey, but this was a free flow question. Please describe in your own words what would make mainland China a more appealing international vacation destination, okay? And in that survey, big survey, and I took data from the authors, okay? It was like 3,263, you know, people participating, right? And they were national survey, again, representative of American leisure population, okay? So the question was like, what are the barriers as perceived by, you know, American travelers towards going to China, and like what are the feelings, attitudes, what they think about this destination, okay? So first of all, we quantified the categories, the topics, and again, easy, everyone knows how to do that, right? So we came with a number of categories, like political system, costs, people, safety. This is people what talk, right? So this is again manifest. You just count, okay? You just count the words, okay? However, when you look what they, you know, tell, some of them like negative. I just didn't put very negative, not to embarrass, you know, like people who are far away, of course, but some of them are more negative, some of them neutral, some of them positive, okay, even when they asked about barriers, right? Some people said great food and great culture, okay? So they kind of like not answering the question, okay? And some of them, many of them said, I don't know, nothing, which was difficult to interpret, okay? So there are two main approaches in classifying sentiments in speech, okay? And they're sort of competing approaches. One is lexical text classification. This is when you rely on the databases, vocabulary databases, and each word has a certain positive or negative rating, okay? And then you add, subtract all these words in your response, and you arrive at the kind of sum, right? And this is the favorability score or sentiment score, okay? There are different bases, databases, and that's because there are different softwares which use different vocabulary databases. The competing approach is non-lexical text classification, and this is a machine learning algorithm. It is kind of like this, the software is trained, okay, to recognize the sentiment in the response by using, the pool of data and kind of like training by itself, okay? So machine learning black box algorithms. So we took for our study one pattern, software. This is from the first group, lexical approach, okay? The second one was SentiStrength, again, the lexical approach based on counting plus minuses and arriving at the final score. And the third one was deeply moving. This is machine learning algorithm developed in the Stanford University, okay? And this is actually from their data site, and they trained this algorithm on movie reviews, okay? And people can go and add, their own, feelings, how they think it should be done, and kind of like adding to the algorithm and kind of like perfecting it, polishing it, okay? So the idea was how to classify the responses, okay? So which algorithm to use? Because when we first used SentiStrength, this one, I kind of was not satisfied because I looked and it didn't look right to me. Okay, so I would classify it differently, right, than many of the responses than this one. So what we decided to do is to give a sample to 2 raters, right, and then run these samples to each, through each software, okay? So if you look at the classification of the 2 raters, you can see that even without disagreement, they sort of agree, right? So most of it have been placed in the negative category, some neutral, and some positive, right? So it's kind of like lopsided distribution, but not that much, maybe, okay? But it's, right. If you look at these 3, you can see that only deeply moving software have a similar distribution to human raters, okay? It's again lopsided, on the negative, and then kind of have, this, shape, right? If you look at pattern, you can see that the most is in the middle category, and SentiStrength is all like neutral, everything is neutral, right? And a little bit on the edges, okay? So we decided to take deeply moving as the most kind of like close to human coding, okay? And see what will we obtain, okay? So before we did comparisons and statistics, we just wanted to validate the coding, okay, by the algorithm. So we run regression. So our dependent was the score, which was given by this deeply moving algorithm. And the independents were categories, which we determined with content analysis previously. And you can see that if we exclude I don't know and, right, they're all, significant. And, and again, the sign's correct. So if people talk about human rights issues in China and they prevent them to go to China, it's negatively affecting the overall score, right? And only the culture category has the positive culture, okay, has the positive effect. We got it as a, some kind of validation, okay, that deeply moving probably gives us not far from what the human would have given to us. So now, this is the distribution of deeply moving, okay? And we did some statistics. So we found that females are more negative than males, right? We didn't find any differences in generation, ethnicity, or life stage, okay, of people. We added the variable from the big survey, interest to go to China, and we can see that people who said that they're not interested in in the future, the near future, they have more negative, again, sentiments about China and barriers, which again we took as a, indicator that deeply moving was probably kind of like doing more or less okay. However, if you look at the distributions of the two automatic classifiers, you can see that Senti strength, that's a totally different distribution, just totally, right? And if you run the same analysis, right, with this dependent, okay, then you will have different results, meaning that depending on the software you use, you have different statistics to report, make different conclusions, meaning that a lot has to be done in terms of, testing the software, find which one is more appropriate and things like that, right? So you cannot just blindly, run through the software and say, claim that you have a valid result, right? So this is my last slide where I would like to point out again, kind of like summary to what we have to be mindful of when we deal with user-generated content, okay? And first of all, I think this is just very, very important. We have to be very careful with defining our population, sampling, and the power to generalize from the sample to population. We shouldn't kind of like overextend ourselves, and we should, be kind of like honest here, right? We found in our review that people who do user-generated content, they kind of like trying to, push these issues to the margins. They don't pay much attention to this. It is probably because they have a pressing issue of hospitality or tourism application for a particular industry or for a particular company. In this case, it's okay. But when you are trying to generalize and say something of more universal value, you have to pay attention to this, right? Now, how you classify is also matters, right? For example, when we compared Russian photographs of American sample and Korean sample, if we come up with a different system of categories, maybe we would again come with, obtain a different result. So our categories should be developed with respect to the research question we, propose. And again, you need to defend your system. You need to test it. You need to, do reliability. As a outcome, like side-by-side product from classification, like Peru paper and Russian paper, we did a methodological study and suggested an indicator which can measure reliability of one-to-many classification. So kind of like methodological issue, like soon will be published. Another thing which I already said, that when you apply software, do it automatic recognition, you have to be, again, very careful. You need to see how close this to, reality, so to speak, right? You need to understand that you need to defend your approach, right? And you need to test your approach and kind of like estimate how big is the measurement errors, generally, right? Next one is that when you have a lot of uncertainty in the sample, like for example, out of 3,000 software responses, survey responses, we had quite a few no, I don't know, and several hundreds basically, right? So how does it affect, again, the results? So you need to see whether people who say, I don't want to know this, whether they're different from the rest, right? So we statistically checked this and found that those who said, I don't know or not sure, they were not statistically different on demographic variables from the rest, right? So you're kind of like testing whether your missing data is, missing at random, or there is a pattern of missing data. And if there is a pattern, then you need to kind of like find out what the pattern is. Okay? I enjoyed visiting. Thank you. All right. Thank you, guys. I know how everyone is, busy scheduling, so I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Yeah.